This is the inaugural episode of our comprehensive series on World War II, a project we've been developing over several months. In this episode, we delve into a conflict marked as the deadliest and most devastating in history, with estimates suggesting it resulted in the loss of 55 to 75 million lives across the globe. While not every nation engaged in the conflict, fighting erupted in every major theater, including Europe, Africa, the Pacific, and Asia. For this series, we have drawn from a variety of sources such as archival documents, books, memoirs, diaries, and particularly newspapers from that era, which offer a fascinating glimpse into the time. In the upcoming episodes, we will systematically explore all the theaters of war, the Eastern and Western fronts along with the Pacific and African fronts, progressing chronologically. Let's get started. Before we dive in, I'd like to point out that our audience has expanded considerably, and many viewers are watching without subscribing. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell to stay updated on our upcoming episodes. World War II officially commenced at 4:26 a.m. on September 1st, marked by the initial combat mission of a Luftwaffe aircraft. A Junkers 87 dive bomber, flown by Bruno Dilly, conducted the first bombing raid on Polish targets. However, while this is accurate from a historical standpoint, the war's true onset can be traced to the phrase, "Grandma has died." This reference connects to the lead-up to the conflict discussed in our episode on the Munich Agreement. If you haven't watched it yet, we encourage you to do so. Let's briefly review the factors that led to World War II, which can be traced back to similar reasons as those for World War I. Following its defeat in World War I, Germany found itself excluded from colonial pursuits and in need of access to capital, consumer markets, and colonies. Its proposal for Western nations to share these resources contributed to the outbreak of World War I, a conflict that ended disastrously for Germany. The nation was burdened with enormous reparations that even the architects of the Versailles Treaty acknowledged were unmanageable for future generations of Germans, regardless of their efforts. Following World War I, Germany was subjected to demilitarization and limitations on the size of its military forces. Additionally, two significant empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, collapsed, resulting in the establishment of numerous new states. This included the Baltic states and independent Finland and Poland, along with Hungary emerging after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. Consequently, the landscape of Europe was fundamentally altered. For Germans, the Treaty of Versailles represented a profound national humiliation on moral, political, and economic fronts. This deep-seated desire for retribution fueled sentiments across the country. Upon assuming power, Hitler recognized these frustrations and set about establishing a new militarized state aimed at reclaiming lost territories and asserting dominance over Western Europe. Clearly, Hitler faced opposition from France and Britain, Germany's primary rivals. The Soviet Union was also a factor, but the situation was complex. A crucial question arises: why didn't the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the United States collaborate early on to thwart Hitler after he annexed Austria or invaded Czechoslovakia? And later, why didn't the Allies come together to halt his advance following the invasion of Poland? The explanation is straightforward. Genuine alliances were absent. Britain and France regarded Stalin's Soviet Union as a significant threat, comparable to Hitler's Germany, and even made military plans against it. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was not passive. By signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with Hitler, it initiated its own expansion efforts, seeking to reclaim territories once part of the Russian Empire. We will delve deeper into this in upcoming episodes. At the same time, the U.S. was reluctant to engage in the war, concentrating instead on a looming conflict with Japan, which ultimately did occur. At that time, there were no genuine allies. However, Poland was guaranteed an alliance. The circumstances surrounding Poland before the war with Hitler were ambiguous. Notably, Poland had once been an ally of Hitler. When Czechoslovakia was being partitioned, Poland claimed the Teschen region and felt quite assured of its standing. So, how did the war actually start? It began with the Polish Corridor. Geographically, Prussia was on one side and the core of Germany on the other, with the Polish Corridor and the free city of Danzig situated in between, effectively dividing German territory. This created several issues, including the transit of goods, payment processes for that transit, and the status of the German population residing in the area. Ultimately, the Germans proposed to the Poles, provide us with this corridor so we can connect our territories, and in return, we will. Negotiations commenced and persisted throughout 1939, during which the Germans suggested offering the Poles Soviet Ukrainian lands, anticipating a conflict with Stalin as well. They argued, "Support us, and your vision of Greater Poland from sea to sea, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, will materialize along with Ukrainian territories. Just grant us the Polish Corridor." However, the Poles declined this proposal. Poland and Germany, while not completely against waging war on the Soviet Union, had established ties at that time, including a non-aggression treaty and a cooperation agreement. They were open to acquiring Ukrainian territories, but unwilling to relinquish the Polish corridor. As tensions heightened, Hitler recognized that war was unavoidable, leading to planning meetings at military headquarters throughout the first half of 1939. All that remained was finding a pretext for conflict. Persistent accusations arose that the Poles were breaching the border and provoking conflict, which Poland denied. They maintained that no provocations were taking place, noting that their military was significantly weaker and they had no intention of engaging in war with Hitler. However, a pretext for conflict was essential, leading to the formulation of Operation Himmler. This plan aimed to orchestrate a series of staged provocations by Polish forces that could be effectively documented and photographed. Ideally, Germany needed a victim from its own population to present to the Western public, allowing it to assert, "Look, the Poles have attacked us. What choice do we have but to defend ourselves? The Third Reich can't ignore threats to its territory." This led to an operation called Canned Goods. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the RSHA, devised a plan. "We'll create a scenario where the Poles seize a border radio station in the German town of Gleiwitz. We'll dress SS officers in Polish uniforms to stage an attack on the radio station, fire shots at the walls, and broadcast a message in Polish declaring, 'We, Greater Poland, are invading Germany because we can no longer endure the Nazi regime's oppression. For this, we'll enlist Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans born in Poland who are fluent in Polish to deliver the message. The primary concern was how to handle the bodies, as they clearly didn't want to kill their own people, leading to the operation being called canned goods. They chose concentration camp prisoners who were already condemned to death, administered lethal injections, and dressed some in Polish uniforms and others in German uniforms to create a staged scene. The narrative was crafted to suggest that a Polish squad had invaded, resulting in a firefight and a takeover of the radio station. Here lie the Polish bodies, along with the German ones, and here are the photos evoking shock, horror, and tragedy. The phrase, "Grandma has died," originated from Naujoks, a subordinate of Heydrich and the operative in charge of executing this plan. He awaited the signal while sitting in a hotel room. The bodies were arranged to create the illusion of a battle, and a broadcast was released claiming that the Poles were plotting an invasion. Hitler seized this opportunity to alarm the Western public, stating, "Look at this atrocity. We must defend our borders." Instead of referring to it as a war, he described it as a Polish campaign, stressing the necessity of safeguarding Germany's frontiers. What was Hitler's strategy? He aimed for a swift victory over Poland, believing that neither Britain nor France would come to its aid, just as they had failed to support Czechoslovakia. After subduing Poland, he intended to propose negotiations, saying, "The Polish army has surrendered. Let's settle our differences and hold a peace conference. We've secured the Polish corridor and a few other territories. Let's establish peace and friendship." However, Hitler's intentions were far from peaceful. He viewed Poland as a critical launch pad that threatened the Reich. With its vast resources, agricultural potential, and ample opportunity for expanding Germany's living space, a key goal for his regime. Hitler's central vision was for Germany to expand its territory to gain more land for agriculture, pastures, and to strengthen its government, ultimately aspiring to become the dominant power in Europe. Seizing Poland would enable plans to mobilize for war against France. If France joined the conflict, Germany was confident it could defeat them. If not, they would be addressed at a later stage. The strategy regarding Britain involved isolating them on their island. At that time, the Soviet Union posed no threat due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which will be addressed shortly. After World War I, Germany faced a challenging situation. The limitations imposed by the Versailles Treaty restricted its army and navy, including ship tonnage, while seeking to train soldiers and armored units. Due to close scrutiny from the French and British, Germany could not conduct military training within its borders. This prompted the establishment of military collaboration with the Soviet Union, where German officers were trained in tanks and aviation, while Germany acquired technology from the Soviets. In exchange, the Soviets provided essential resources, such as grain and oil, creating a mutually advantageous relationship. A month prior to the war, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, leading to several interpretations of its significance. One key interpretation is that Stalin and Hitler agreed to partition Europe, with Stalin potentially aiming to reclaim Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other territories. However, the exact motivations behind Stalin's actions remain uncertain. This interpretation is merely speculative. What is evident is that Stalin sought to regain lands formerly part of the Russian Empire, Additionally, the Red Army was in the process of modernization, receiving new weapons and preparing for possible conflict, indicating that Stalin had plans in mind. Conversely, Stalin recognized that conflict with Hitler was unavoidable. The diplomatic pact served as a means to purchase time, postponing the war for as long as he could. This delay of 2 years allowed the Soviet Army to implement reforms, mobilize forces, and position troops, although the process was not fully realized by 1941, as will be discussed. Stalin advocated for military and economic alliances to promote cooperative defense and strengthen economic relationships. But negotiations stalled. Both Britain and France viewed Stalin as a threat, which effectively drove him to strike a deal with Hitler. Aware that war was imminent in Europe, Stalin sought to position the Soviet Union advantageously. His strategy involved allowing Germany, France, and Britain to deplete each other through conflict, while the USSR worked towards its foreign policy objectives, potentially without needing to enter the war itself. I believe these were Stalin's considerations at the time. As previously mentioned, the USSR sought agreements with both Britain and France, but they declined. In contrast, negotiations with Hitler progressed rapidly. Within just 2 months, the accord was finalized because Hitler instructed Ribbentrop to accommodate everything Stalin wanted. This arrangement was highly advantageous for Germany as it mitigated the risk of a war on multiple fronts against Poland, the Soviet Union, and potentially Britain and France. Hitler preferred to focus solely on Poland, allowing him to enter the war with greater freedom of action. On August 31st, the code phrase, "Grandma has died," was received, leading to the seizure of the radio station as German troops advanced into Poland. The first bombing raid occurred at 4:26 a.m., followed by gunfire in the free city of Danzig at 4:45 a.m. Just a week earlier, the aging German battleship Schleswig-Holstein had arrived for a friendly visit and promptly attacked Polish fortifications. On the same day, the first aerial dogfight erupted, with Luftwaffe pilot Frank Neubert downing the first Polish fighter. The war had commenced, and there would be no turning back. On the day of the invasion, September 1st, the Soviet Union lowered the conscription age from 21 to 19, marking the start of a covert mobilization as troops were moved closer to the Polish border. While I previously stated that the war was unstoppable, there was a brief attempt at prevention. On September 2nd, Mussolini proposed a peace conference involving Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. However, Italy's influence in Europe was minimal at the time, leading British and French leaders to state they would only agree to a conference after Germany withdrew its troops from Czechoslovakia and Poland and ceased its offensive. Unsurprisingly, Hitler dismissed this proposal, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany on September 3rd. Following this announcement, various British dominions, including Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, also declared war, with Canada joining shortly afterward. An interesting situation arose in Spain regarding Francisco Franco. Generally viewed negatively for initiating a civil war that led to widespread bloodshed, undermining the independence of Catalonia and the Basque regions, and stifling local governance, many Spaniards nonetheless expressed gratitude to him for keeping Spain out of World War II. Spain was the first nation to declare neutrality, clearly stating, "We will not participate we are not aligned with either side. Our ports remain open, our banking system is functional, and we will remain uninvolved. It's business as usual. From the outset of the war, Poland faced dire circumstances. By September 5th, the Polish government and its gold reserves had been moved from Warsaw to Lublin. At that time, the Fourth Army, commanded by Klug, and the Third Army, led by Kuchler, had encircled one of Poland's military divisions, leading to the surrender of Polish forces. By September 6th, the Germans had taken control of Krakow. Now, let's turn our focus to another region of the world. If I were writing this blog from a Chinese perspective, I would highlight that while Europe was just beginning hostilities with Hitler's invasion of Poland, China had already been entrenched in a brutal war with Japan for quite some time. Japan had initiated a full-scale invasion of China and was engaged in fierce conflict that drew the attention of the Americans, British, and French, who sought to mediate. However, Japan's insistence on establishing a puppet government to protect its economic interests led to widespread violence. Additionally, Japan periodically invaded Mongolia, resulting in confrontations with Soviet forces. For example, on September 5th, 2 battalions of Japanese troops attempted to seize the heights at Khalkhin Gol, but suffered casualties of 350 men. Consequently, Japan was also in a relentless state of military conflict with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Germans had captured Krakow, while the Soviet Union was secretly mobilizing its forces. In Germany, a significant act of censorship was implemented, introducing the death penalty for actions perceived as jeopardizing national defense. This severe measure applied to any acts of sabotage, subversion, or incitement related to defense or military industries, effectively imposing a death sentence for such offenses. You might wonder what the French and British were doing between their declaration of war on September 3rd and the subsequent events on September 6th. During this period, they were primarily involved in what would later be known as the Phony War. Complying with their alliance commitments to Poland, the French army advanced into the Rhine Valley and captured 12 German towns. It appeared to be an opportune moment to strike at Germany's rear, especially with British forces anticipated to join, potentially creating a two-front war. However, the conflict did not progress as expected. The Rhine Valley was secured by the Siegfried Line, a robust German defensive system. Following World War I, constructing such fortified lines became a favored military strategy. These defenses typically included trenches, permanent gun emplacements across multiple levels, underground arsenals, and surface batteries. Additionally, they were equipped with communication networks, field hospitals, and anti-tank obstacles. Various European countries adopted similar fortifications. France developed the Maginot Line to guard against potential German attacks. Finland implemented the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus, and Belgium constructed its own fortified line to defend the Albert Canal from possible invasions. This defensive approach was grounded in the trench warfare strategies of World War I, which involved positioning soldiers in deep trenches and waging a prolonged, stagnant conflict. A major factor contributing to France's eventual defeat was its reliance on an outdated military doctrine that anticipated a slow and stationary war. In contrast, the Germans, leveraging their tank divisions and executing surprise attacks, would eventually overwhelm the French forces. For an entire year, the conflict remained at a stalemate. During this period, the French remained static, engaging in sporadic artillery exchanges and occasional air raids over the Ruhr, with little significant outcome. Ultimately, this phase was regarded as a farce, prompting France to adopt an aggressive defense strategy. They occupied German territory under the belief that it ensured protection against German attacks, a period later termed the Phony War, which would continue for a year. On September 9th, the Polish Poznan Army, commanded by Tadeusz Kościuszko, engaged in a significant battle against the German Eighth Army, led by General Johannes Blaskowitz, but ultimately suffered defeat. This setback precipitated a rapid decline. The Germans advanced to the outskirts of Warsaw, and on September 12th, the encircled Polish army near Radom surrendered, resulting in the capture of 60,000 Polish soldiers. At this juncture, with news from Poland, the French halted their advance into the Rhineland upon orders from the French General Staff due to the rapid developments in Poland. This decision was rather paradoxical, since the Germans had not yet captured Warsaw. Recognizing that a quick capture was unfeasible, they replaced the tank divisions surrounding the city with infantry units to lay siege to Warsaw, while the German 14th Army moved toward Lwów. This leads to another crucial point. Prior to the war, the Germans sought alliances with Ukrainian nationalists. Kościuszko recruited agents, aware of the significant tensions between Ukrainians and Poles, and aimed to utilize these agents for sabotage operations to destabilize the Polish rear, particularly given the uncertain relations with the Soviet Union at that time, a period preceding the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. However, once Hitler signed the pact with the Soviets, Kościuszko and the Western Ukrainian nationalists were swiftly disregarded, as their assistance was no longer deemed necessary. The promises made to them, such as plans for moving into Poland and granting independence to Western Ukraine to establish a Ukrainian state, were promptly abandoned. The German troops advanced to the city of Lwów, which was part of Poland at the time. By September 14th, Guderian's tanks had penetrated to Brest, where Polish forces mounted a valiant defense of the Brest fortress, enduring for several days. Ultimately, the fortress fell, and by that same date, the Germans had fully encircled Warsaw. The German army achieved a swift victory over Poland in just 14 days. At this juncture, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov met with German Ambassador Schulenburg in Moscow. Molotov expressed that, under their pact, the Soviets aimed to safeguard the interests of working-class peasants in Belarus and Western Ukraine, and to unite Western Ukraine with its eastern counterparts. He indicated that Soviet troops were prepared to enter Poland and sought to know when Warsaw would fall. Schulenburg responded that it would take a few more days before the Soviets could advance into Poland. Meetings between Molotov and Schulenburg continued several times a week, addressing various issues concerning German-Soviet relations. For Hitler, these discussions were vital as he carefully monitored Stalin's position and potential actions. This was one of the initial meetings conducted during the Polish campaign. By September 15th, the German army had advanced to the lines of Białystok, Bielsk, Brest-Litovsk, and Osowiec. Unlike previous accounts of Osowiec, there would be no heroic defense this time, as it now lay within Polish territory. The German forces reached this front line, encircled the city of Lwów, and issued a 12-hour ultimatum to Warsaw. The city had to disarm, civilians must evacuate, or face surrender within that time frame. The Germans issued a warning that failure to comply would result in an assault on the city, but the Poles refused the ultimatum. On the 16th, Germany's Army Group North and Army Group South united, encircling two Polish armies, the last substantial military force Poland had. Recognizing the dire situation, the Polish government sought a transit route through Romania, intending to flee to Romanian territory and then travel to France. The Romanians consented to this request, effectively telling the Poles, "Feel free to escape if necessary." As the Germans launched their attack on Warsaw, the Poles requested the evacuation of civilians, but the Germans denied this request, insisting, "We gave you 12 hours and you didn't comply. There is no excuse." Then, at 6 a.m. on September 17th, the Soviet Red Army advanced across the Polish border. Molotov proclaimed over the radio that the Polish state had collapsed, emphasizing the need to protect the oppressed working class and peasants from capitalist landowners and to reunite the brotherly peoples of Belarus and Western Ukraine with their historical homeland. Consequently, Soviet troops moved into Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. On that same day, a significant event occurred: the signing of a truce between the Soviet Union and Japan. I touched on this briefly in the episode about Pearl Harbor. Japan was weighing its options for its next military campaign after China, contemplating whether to take on Russia or America. This first truce with the Soviet Union was a strategic decision, as Japan was not prepared to engage in war with the Soviets. They lacked sufficient tanks and did not have a clear strategy for operating over the vast Russian territory. Consequently, they opted to sign the truce. On September 18th, the Soviet army captured the city of Vilna, now known as Vilnius, which was part of Poland at that time. Around this period, German and Soviet forces converged near Brest-Litovsk. The following day, September 19th, marked a significant setback for the Polish army at the Battle of Bzura, resulting in their surrender and the capture of 170,000 Polish soldiers. Simultaneously, in naval operations, the Germans sank their first British warship, HMS Courageous. What was the British response? Were they bombing Berlin, Hamburg, Kiel, or the Danish island of Sylt, where German artillery was stationed? Surprisingly, none of that. Instead, the British were focused on a different approach. They were distributing millions of leaflets across Germany, having effectively used propaganda during World War I. As mentioned in a previous episode, they were now reviving this strategy to sway public opinion by dropping leaflets. This tactic mirrored their World War I efforts to weaken civilian morale while armies occupied the trenches. However, this time, it produced no significant impact. German society was brimming with enthusiasm due to their successes in Poland and a sense of national unity. However, the leaflets dropped by the British had no effect. Internally, Germany was facing a challenging economic situation, leading to the introduction of rationing for essential items like bread, meat, and butter for the first time. Although it's not the main focus of this episode or our historical series, it's noteworthy how various countries managed food rationing during the war. Germany rationed bread, meat, and butter, while the British initially restricted bacon, ham, butter, and meat, highlighting that bacon and ham were absent from the German rations. Meanwhile, the French maintained a low profile, entrenched in the Rhineland and largely inactive. In Moscow, Voroshilov met with the German military attaché to discuss a timeline for the withdrawal of German troops from western Ukraine and western Belarus, in line with diplomatic agreements that would permit the entry of Soviet forces. On September 21st, a civilian uprising broke out in Warsaw, initiated by police, remaining soldiers and civilians. However, it was swiftly subdued. The Soviet Union and Germany engaged in discussions to establish a demarcation line, effectively negotiating their new border in the absence of Poland, which resulted in a shared boundary between the two nations. Regarding coverage from the Western press, I will refrain from citing Soviet newspapers, as they are often criticized for propaganda, a practice also seen in German, British, and French media outlets. This was the information conveyed by American reports. On September 22nd, the German and Soviet armies held a joint military parade in Brest, showcasing troops marching in formation before their commanders. This event symbolized the agreement between the two nations and the establishment of a shared border, effectively marking the conclusion of Poland's existence as an independent state. On September 23rd, Germany's High Command declared the Polish campaign concluded. Interestingly, Hitler delivered his first wartime speech on September 1st, donning a military uniform for the first time in years. From that moment forward, he would consistently wear military attire for significant speeches, portraying himself as a humble corporal who had experienced trench warfare firsthand, in contrast to the Prussian generals. The portrayal of Hitler as a common soldier would be utilized consistently by German propaganda during the war. On September 24th, the British commenced the transfer of troops to France after lengthy negotiations in Parliament regarding troop numbers and detailed planning with the French. As those plans were being finalized, Poland had already succumbed. Thus, on September 24th, the British initiated their troop transfer to France, gearing up for serious combat. Concurrently, Moscow was starting to navigate a new diplomatic landscape. With the situation in western Ukraine and western Belarus resolved, Stalin's government shifted its focus to the Baltic states and Finland. Diplomatic efforts with the Baltic nations commenced as Molotov conferred with Estonian representatives in Moscow to negotiate a trade agreement. The Estonians reported that the trade discussion lasted roughly 15 minutes before Molotov shifted to the main issue. While trade is important, we must address the core matter. We require military bases in Estonia as we anticipate that the war in Europe will intensify, and we cannot predict potential threats to the Soviet Union. Although we currently have a peace treaty with Germany, it could change at any moment. Furthermore, Britain and France are clearly antagonistic. We must ensure that Baltic territories do not become launch points for enemy attacks on Soviet territory. Molotov explicitly expressed the Soviet desire to establish a military base in Estonia, accompanied by a contingent of $15,000 to 20,000 troops. Meanwhile, on September 25th, the Germans launched a devastating bombing campaign over Warsaw. This brutal assault served more as an act of intimidation than as a tactical military move, sending a clear message to Polish resistance and civilians Do you think you can oppose us? We will crush you into submission swiftly. On that same day, Hitler signed a notable document. Despite the alliance with the Soviet Union and the Baltics falling within its sphere of influence, Hitler started making preparations for the invasion and annexation of Lithuania. In Germany, the rationing system expanded further, requiring ration cards for popular food items. On September 25th, Bulgarian sources reported that Ukrainians and Belarusians were very eager about the arrival of the Soviet army, as those regions would soon be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Estonians swiftly formalized agreements with Molotov in Moscow, consenting to a trade deal and the establishment of a Soviet military base in Estonia, with a contingent of 25,000 troops. On September 26th, German forces initiated their attack on Warsaw, while Ribbentrop traveled to Moscow to propose a new agreement to Stalin and Molotov concerning their mutual border, rather than demarcation lines. Shifting focus to France, the primary adversary was Germany, and preparations for war were underway with troops deployed in the Rhineland. However, notable developments within France included the complete ban of the Communist Party, highlighting the seriousness with which the French, though to a lesser extent the British, treated the communist threat at that time. It's essential to recognize that leftist ideologies, especially communism, gained significant traction in post-World War I Europe. Organizations like the Comintern and various women's groups, largely aligned with leftist beliefs, championed principles of equality, solidarity, and social justice. These concepts resonated strongly in capitalist Europe, leading to fears among the French, British, and Germans. Intellectual elites embraced these ideologies and disseminated them to the broader population. Consequently, France's decision to ban the Communist Party of France aligned with the dominant Western response to this growing threat. By September 28th, Warsaw had succumbed to German forces, marking the last time Poland would be mentioned as a state until 1945. On the same day, Stalin received the ratified treaty with Estonia and signed it, telling the Estonians, "You made a wise decision, very foresighted. Otherwise, you might have faced a fate like Poland." By the end of September, Hitler had achieved his primary goals, successfully avoiding a two-front war. From September 29th into early October, German troops no longer needed in Poland were reassigned to the West. During this time, the American news agency United Press coined the phrase "phony war." They reported, "Our journalists are on the scene and something unusual is occurring. The French are in their trenches. Journalists are visiting them. There are women present, and they're enjoying wine on the weekends. Meanwhile, trains filled with German soldiers pass by without being bombed or attacked. Nothing is happening. What's going on? It's a phony war." This marked the first use of the term phony war. Germany and the Soviet Union were discussing a new border agreement, formerly known as the Treaty of Friendship and Borders. Simultaneously, General Sikorsky was in the process of establishing the Polish government in exile in France. Although two centers of Polish resistance would initially form, London ultimately emerged as the primary hub. Governments in exile from all countries occupied by Germany would be established, and after the fall of France, the Polish government, along with other exiled governments such as those of Norway and part of Czechoslovakia, would relocate to London, creating a vital center of resistance consisting of these exiled administrations. After banning the Communist Party in France, the authorities took additional measures by confiscating the party's assets. This decision faced backlash from allies like Britain, which contended it infringed upon freedom of expression and political choice. However, the French dismissed these concerns and pressed on with their anti-communist campaign. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Japan launched an assault on Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, signaling the beginning of the significant Sichuan campaign. By October 10th, German forces, no longer engaged in conflict in Poland, were moved in large numbers to the Western Front. Observing this shift, the French withdrew their troops behind the Maginot Line. French soldiers settled into their bunkers, passing time by smoking, listening to records, and mocking the Germans, trusting in the impenetrability of the Maginot Line. This advanced, modern defensive structure left them feeling completely secure and relaxed. Meanwhile, Warsaw had fallen. The Sonderkommandos, special units, initiated repressive actions in the city as the Wehrmacht made its entrance. In response, a resistance group known as Service for Poland's Victory was established, which would conduct guerrilla warfare against the Germans throughout World War II. The New York Times featured a critical article on the Soviet-Estonian trade agreement, arguing that Estonia had been coerced into what was essentially a military pact disguised as a trade deal. The piece pointed out Estonia's inability to resist and highlighted the gradual subjugation of the Baltic region under Stalin's authority. Meanwhile, in the USSR, the Panama Declaration was adopted, which included a significant provision for creating a safety zone extending 300 to 1,000 kilometers from American shores. This area would primarily be monitored by U.S. military vessels, with the participation of Latin American ships encouraged. Essentially, this initiative aimed to enhance American control over the continent and its island bases, ensuring a secure zone while regulating maritime movements in parts of the Atlantic and Pacific. As the Soviet Union aimed to safeguard itself by deploying military forces in the Baltics and engaging in conflict with Finland, the U.S. was conveying to its Latin American neighbors and even Japan, despite not being adjacent, that it dominated the surrounding oceans and any actions would require its approval. In this context, major powers were all striving to create protective buffers, whether through adjacent nations or aquatic borders, to secure their interests. On October 4th, the British cabinet in London endorsed the Balfour Plan for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. While this specific topic is not the main focus of our discussion, it highlights a significant inconsistency in Britain's approach to the Jewish issue. On one hand, they promoted the founding of a Jewish state. On the other, they obstructed Romanian efforts to transport Jews, a vital evacuation route to Palestine. Despite the British claiming there was no capacity to accept more individuals, this effectively severed a crucial escape pathway for Jews fleeing Nazi genocide. However, that discussion will come later. For now, we focus on the Balfour Plan. On October 5th, Hitler oversaw a military parade in Warsaw, where he proclaimed that the Reich was now secure and boasted about vanquishing the Polish military beast that had dared to challenge them. His comments made it evident that Poland would be annexed by Germany and transformed into the general government. In Moscow, Molotov engaged with representatives from Lithuania, proposing a deal akin to the one offered to Estonia. We will sign a trade agreement and simultaneously set up a military base staffed by a limited contingent of 25,000 troops. The Soviet Union extended a similar offer to Finland, although they did not anticipate any acceptance from the Finns. Here's where it becomes intriguing. In 1918, the First Karelian War erupted, pitting the Finns against the Red Army. During this period, Mannerheim took his sword oath, committing to expel the Leninist hooligans, thieves, and murderers from Finland. This vow contributed to the rise of the ultra-nationalist vision of a greater Finland, which encompassed regions of Karelia and Ingria. National governments were actively contemplating expansion strategies. At this time, Finland harbored intense anti-Soviet sentiment, which contrasts sharply with its later friendly relations with the Soviet Union after World War II. Prior to the war, however, the Finnish government and establishment were firmly opposed to the Soviet Union. On October 6th, Hitler dispatched covert diplomatic messages to London and Paris proposing the prospect of peace talks. We have resolved the Polish question. It is no longer an issue. Can we begin negotiations? The French and British dismissed this overture. Concurrently, the Japanese launched a new offensive, which included a battle where 90,000 Japanese soldiers faced off against 180,000 Chinese troops, underscoring the brutal nature of the conflict. Following the rejection from the British and French, Hitler publicly declared that peace had been achieved in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, asserting that the interests of Germany and the Soviet Union were completely aligned in preserving this peace. This claim was reported by the Pravda newspaper. The Germans held out for another day, hoping the British would reconsider, but both Britain and France remained steadfast in their stance. On October 8th, Hitler enacted a decree that effectively dissolved Poland, establishing it as the general government under the notorious Hans Frank as its first governor. Frank would later be responsible for immense suffering and bloodshed, establishing Jewish ghettos and committing horrific acts. Despite his infamy, one truth remains clear. Poland had officially disappeared, and the general government had been established. Meanwhile, the Germans discovered that the Soviet Union was in discussions with Turkey. As a southern neighbor influenced by France and Britain, Turkey raised alarms in Germany about a possible alliance and an incoming threat to their southern border. Intelligence reports confirmed these negotiations, prompting Schulenburg, the German ambassador in Moscow, to confront Molotov with the question, "What are you discussing with the Turks?" The Soviet Foreign Ministry replied, expressing confusion at Germany's apprehension. "We believe our German partners are overreacting. We are free to engage with Turkey as we wish and have no plans against you." Despite this reassurance, a report was forwarded to Berlin indicating that the Soviet Union was negotiating with Turkey. It also highlighted that the Soviets were moving troops into Estonia, with plans to do the same in Latvia, Lithuania, and Turkey. Hitler was warned that the Soviets might be plotting something. On October 9th, Hitler advanced further by signing Directive Gelb, which detailed the strategy to invade France and overpower the Franco-British forces. Preparations for the Western Front offensive commenced. On October 10th, a grim milestone marked the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Lublin, where Jews from across Poland began to be transported. In time, those from Pomerania, Silesia, and Austria would also be sent there. Simultaneously, negotiations continued in Moscow between the Soviet Union and Lithuania, with the Soviets seeking to establish a base in Lithuania while offering Vilnius, then known as Vilna, to the Lithuanians. Lithuania accepted this proposal, and a treaty was prepared for signing. Prior to this, Kaunas was the capital of Lithuania, not Vilnius. However, under the treaty, Vilna, previously part of Poland, was transferred to Lithuania. Additionally, talks commenced regarding the deployment of a small Soviet military presence in Lithuania. On October 11th, a significant event unfolded as a team of scientists, including Albert Einstein, penned a letter warning that Germany was pursuing the development of an atomic bomb. Initial responses to the letter were muted, as the true implications of an atomic bomb were not widely grasped. Nevertheless, the U.S. began preparations for its own atomic program. Meanwhile, Stalin was informed and asserted that the Soviet Union also required its own nuclear project. The most crucial news was that Germany was already progressing toward building the bomb and was close to its development. However, fortunately, the Germans never succeeded in creating nuclear weapons during the war. As previously noted, Hans Frank was appointed as the first governor of the general government in Poland, where mass deportations of Jews persisted and extended to include those from Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Pomerania. Jews from various regions were forcibly moved into ghettos, which essentially served as concentration camps. Negotiations commenced between the Soviet Union and Finland, centering on the strategic significance of Leningrad. Stalin expressed concern about the city's proximity to a potential enemy army and requested that the border be moved 40 miles away. While this was the primary demand, additional related discussions also took place. The Soviet Union insisted that Finland surrender the Hanko Peninsula and all outer islands in the Gulf of Finland, vital for protecting shipping lanes and serving as critical strategic locations. In exchange, Stalin proposed granting Finland a larger area in Karelia, which, while militarily less significant, was twice the size of the territory being requested. Finland declined the offer, and negotiations persisted, though it became evident that mutual concessions were unlikely. On October 14th, the British recognized that their previous sense of invulnerability from World War I was over. Scapa Flow, the principal base of the British fleet, was heavily fortified with anti-aircraft guns and an air defense system, making it nearly impervious to aerial attack. Nevertheless, the German submarine U-47 daringly penetrated the harbor and sank the battleship Royal Oak, resulting in the deaths of 800 men. The operation was executed with astonishing boldness. The submarine entered the harbor, surfaced to launch its torpedoes, then disappeared back underwater and left the bay. The crew aboard the Royal Oak initially believed they were under air attack from German planes, leading to chaotic anti-aircraft fire and frantic searches of the skies, while the submarine retreated undetected. The British were left dumbfounded by such a catastrophic incident. The British press claimed that German planes had assaulted Scapa Flow, with the Times minimizing the incident by reporting that only an outdated dreadnought from World War I was damaged, despite the loss of one of the British fleet's most prominent ships. In mid-October, the Soviet embassy in the Baltics received a secret message from Molotov, instructing them to discontinue all interactions with local movements. The dispatch emphasized avoiding any actions that could be perceived as Soviet interference in the internal affairs of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia. Molotov ordered no meetings or receptions for Latvian delegations and advised turning any contact over to local authorities. He asserted that the Soviet Union aimed not to interfere in the sovereignty of the Baltic states, but merely intended to establish military bases there. This raises a crucial issue. Some contend that Stalin had always intended to annex the Baltic states. While we cannot definitively ascertain his thoughts, the realities show that the Baltics were eventually annexed. However, at this early stage, even into 1940, Molotov was consistently sending directives for embassies to halt all communication with friendly organizations, effectively prohibiting any interaction to prevent suspicions of Soviet interference in their internal matters. The first clash between the SS and the Wehrmacht arose in Germany following the Polish campaign. Wehrmacht generals protested to Hitler, arguing that numerous SS officers should face trial for acts of torture, violence, and looting. The Wehrmacht considered itself a disciplined professional Prussian officer corps, viewing the SS as thugs and criminals. In response to these grievances, Hitler sided with the SS. On October 17th, he issued a decree exempting SS officers and personnel from military courts. They would instead be tried by their internal tribunals. This decision sparked significant conflict, as the Wehrmacht believed that the SS was compromising military discipline and tarnishing the honor of the Prussian tradition. However, Hitler dismissed these concerns, perceiving the SS as his personal guard and intent on safeguarding them. This loyalty was evident to those within Germany at the time, but not obvious to outsiders. Meanwhile, plans for Poland began to take shape. General Halder's diaries, released after the war, would reveal that the main targets in Poland were its elites, landowners, industrialists, intellectuals, and clergy, who were to be either imprisoned in camps or executed. The objective was to reduce Poland to a region with a low standard of living, where slave labor would be sent to Germany to meet its agricultural and industrial demands. In essence, Poland was intended to become a land of slaves. This strategy would later be fully detailed during the Nuremberg trials, but on October 18th, Halder noted a direct reference to Poland's future in his diary. Halder recorded, "Today's discussions with the Führer centered on the Polish issue. We do not intend to restore Poland. Safeguards for the proposed actions are still incomplete. Poland must serve as a launching point for future German military operations. It should have its own self-governing bodies, but not adhere to German governance standards. The Polish intelligentsia must be prevented from becoming the ruling class. A low standard of living must persist, sustained by cheap slave labor." Halder stated, "All undesirable elements must be expelled from German territories," summarizing the main points Hitler raised during their meeting. This account is significant for two reasons. It offers insight into the German perspective on their treatment of occupied territories, and it highlights October 18, 1939, the date of Hitler's meeting. Why is this date significant? A historical myth suggests that Hitler and Stalin secretly convened in Lwów on October 18th with 2 armored trains, one carrying each leader, arriving in a city sealed off by Soviet and German troops for the meeting. However, this assertion is questionable, as German forces had already withdrawn from Lwów by that time. The origin of this story appears to stem from a memo by J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, addressed to one of President Roosevelt's aides, which claimed that Hitler and Stalin had met in secret. Why would they meet in secret when they had an open channel of communication with Molotov in Moscow? This idea appears to be a historical myth, easily debunked by solid evidence. On that day, Stalin was occupied with meetings with Molotov and Zhdanov, while Hitler was engaged in discussions regarding Poland. Thus, neither leader could have been in Lwów. On October 19th, German forces started gearing up for Operation Gelb, the scheduled invasion of France, which Hitler approved and set for November. Meanwhile, in Turkey, crucial negotiations were taking place among Britain, France, and Turkey, leading to the signing of an alliance treaty. As part of this agreement, the British also discussed a potential airstrike on Baku. Why target Baku? By this time, Britain had initiated a blockade of German seaports to restrict food and material shipments. In retaliation, Germany commenced submarine warfare, sinking Allied transport vessels, escalating the economic conflict. However, due to its agreement with the Soviet Union, Germany continued to receive oil and wheat via railways. Consequently, the British and French contemplated bombing not only Baku, but also Batumi and Poti, planning airstrikes from bases in Iran and Turkey to sever Germany's supply of Soviet oil. The British and French considered targeting the Soviet oil infrastructure, but leaks revealed these plans to Moscow. Around this period, Molotov sent another message to Soviet embassies in the Baltic states, reiterating his weekly warning against engaging with communist factions in those nations. On October 19th, he transmitted yet another letter, or rather, an encrypted telegram, emphasizing this point. On the same day in the United States, a significant event occurred: the inaugural meeting of the Uranium Committee, which commenced discussions on developing an American atomic weapon. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler's approved Gelb plan faced heavy criticism from the German High Command. Keitel, in particular, opposed the plan vehemently. During a troop inspection, German generals informed Hitler that the army was not prepared for war. Chief of the General Staff Halder was present at the inspection and recognized that the current plan would lead to some units lagging behind, logistical issues, supply shortages, and fragmented marching columns. All the commanders cautioned Hitler about their unpreparedness for war. However, he dismissed their apprehensions, claiming, "This is the same nonsense you told me about Poland." Ultimately, Poland was defeated within 2 weeks. As a result, Hitler maintained that the invasion of France would proceed in early November. Nevertheless, adverse weather conditions that hindered air operations led to multiple delays in executing Plan Gelb, which ultimately wouldn't launch until May 1940. Despite these setbacks, tensions within the German High Command escalated, and a conspiracy against Hitler began to emerge, the same one previously referenced in relation to Operation Valkyrie. Many German generals increasingly believed that Eliminating Hitler was necessary, fearing that the war against France and Britain, despite the swift victory in Poland, could result in disaster, reminiscent of World War I's conclusion in 1918. They felt ill-equipped for such a conflict. This was the prevailing atmosphere at Hitler's headquarters during that time. In November, a second round of negotiations commenced in Moscow between Finland and the Soviet Union, but both sides maintained their original positions. The Soviets sought to shift the border by 40 to 70 kilometers and acquire strategic islands, while Finland was offered territories in Karelia, which were twice the size of what they had initially requested. However, Finland remained unwilling to compromise. Simultaneously, the Soviet Military Council submitted a plan to Stalin aimed at annihilating the Finnish Land Army and Navy, indicating that the Soviet Union was gearing up for war with Finland as negotiations stalled. In the Atlantic, another noteworthy development occurred. The German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee was dispatched to southern waters with the objective of sinking Allied vessels. Among its targets was a large Shell oil tanker of 706 tons, which it successfully sank. The Graf Spee proved to be a significant nuisance for the British, causing widespread disruption throughout the fall and early winter in the Atlantic by sinking numerous Allied tankers and cargo ships, posing a substantial challenge for the British Admiralty. In Japan, the economic strain from the war intensified, prompting the government to implement fixed prices for rice and compel farmers to sell their produce to supply the military. Meanwhile, in Germany, a power struggle between the General Staff and Hitler persisted into early November. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch attempted to dissuade Hitler from invading France,